Mary Me, Annie here. I'm going to talk about the Rede in this video. I'm going to put a link below to a blog I wrote recently. When you think of the Rede, do you think of the 8 words? Some of you may be surprised that for those of us who have been practicing traditionally for quite some years, that didn't exist. It wasn't part of our training. I came up in the early 70s in a traditional Wiccan coven. The 8 words did not exist. So, on the one hand, when people have great debates over what the Rede might be and might not be, I'm out of it, only to a certain extent, because the Rede, as in those words, wasn't part of what I first learned. However, the spirit of the Rede very much was. I often see when people share their thoughts on what the Rede is, they go out of their way to make sure that we know that they do not consider it to be a law. They let us know that the etymology of the word is guidance. And in fact, they'll often say, as they tell us this, merely guidance. And none of us like to be told what to do, so I understand where that comes from. And many of us have come from religious backgrounds where there were so many prescriptions and laws that we're not looking for new ones. However, I look at the Rede a different way. First, I look at the word read a little bit differently. Yes, I absolutely agree that the historical content of the word meant counsel. But it just didn't mean advice. There was a shading to the word read that had to do with reading, giving counsel, and giving counsel from a place of collective wisdom. In a way, an acknowledgement that your elders knew better, but not in the sense that the elder who gives you the advice knew better, but that they are the product of the experience and practice and wisdom of all who came before them. Rede in that sense comes from a place of, and it's another historical background to the word, of governing with counsel. So the essence of, if it's a rule, it's a golden rule. It is something that those who have come before, the collective wisdom of your practice or your culture or your society, knows something from their collective experience that they'd like to pass on to you. So I do not release the fact that Rede means advice or counsel, but it is counsel coming from this place of wisdom. So why is the concept of the Rede so important? And it is the most important spiritual principle in my practice. Why is it so important to me if I'm telling you that those words did not exist in my early training? Because the spirit of the words very much existed. Harm, the word harm, is constantly discussed in Gerald's guidelines in the old book. And you'll see it. It's public. You can easily research it and find it. He is constantly addressing the concept of harm. He talks about it from many different perspectives, and one of the perspectives is if a witch uses their powers to harm another, they will more than likely bring attention to themselves. And in certain days and certain times, no witch wanted to bring attention to themselves. He also addresses harm in several different examples of a community benefits by what it takes to create, to make a positive forward. That more often than not, a community does not benefit from judging and destructing. You may agree or not agree with that, but he was speaking on behalf of what is best in a sense of community. So it's not that this witch gets pissed at somebody who she feels has done something terribly evil and goes after that person. There was a sense of suspension of moral judgment. Just as we don't want to be judged by another in this free-thinking spiritual practice, there is a sense that there's a lot of responsibility when one decides to judge another. He encourages that if you're in doubt about whether you should address an issue by some form of harm, that you discuss it with others. Discuss it with the coven, other witches. Seek advice before taking action. He especially encourages that action be something that's done collectively, something that's done together. That way there's a bit of a balancing between those of us who tend to be hot-headed and have an opinion and get an attitude and maybe pass a judgment. Now, he's not saying, and he uses several examples also, he's not saying you turn your cheek. He's not saying you turn your back on something that's being done that's negative or hurtful or harmful. He does very specifically counsel that the harm that we do should be on the action and not on the source of the action. In other words, something that's done with evil intent. The power of the witch, who he tells us constantly has the power to do literally anything they want, manifest anything they want. The power of the witch is they can null that energy. Keep it from its destination. Keep it from manifesting the change that was intended by whomever or whatever sent out that negative energy. He in no way tells us to leave things unaddressed. In fact, he constantly lets us know we have the power to address anything we want. But he constantly uses the word harm in the context of stop, think, deal with the problem. Deal what comes out of the problem, what it is creating. Don't harm the source. We talked about this constantly. It was probably, I don't know, maybe 5 years into my practice before I ever heard the Rede as a poem. We worked on the concept of harm. The only quote we used in those times was one from St. Augustine, which, if I remember it correctly, was love and harm none. Two ways of looking at every problem. Every situation we face which requires a drastic action to curtail something else, something we perceive as harmful. Yeah, you can go right to the source and harm the harm doer. Or take action on the energy that person has created, the energy the situation has created. Void it, null it, deal with it, absolutely destroy it. In those long conversations about the word harm, mind you again, not about the Rede, we didn't know it was such a thing, about the word harm, we also talked about the physician's oath. First, do no harm. Take a pause, a sacred pause. Consider the situation. Consider that you have all the information you need. Look for a way to solve the problem that has to do with protection, nulling of energy, redirection of energy, all the different ways a witch knows to work with incoming energy. That doesn't mean we all agree with it. It doesn't mean because we're Wiccan that we are too timid to take care of business. I can guarantee you I have taken care of business many times in my life. But first, I stop to think. Where's my reactive emotion to what I perceive of as negative, if not evil, coming from? And how are the many ways I could address the issue? Now, somewhere in the 60s, the Rede started being heard more overseas than here in America yet. And it came out of a public talk that Doreen Valiente gave, in which she introduced it. And that started being quoted and repeated, and eventually we started hearing snippets of that on this side of the ocean too. It was the middle 70s before we actually knew of something specifically called the Rede, which was 8 words, the Wiccan Rede, fulfill, and it harm none, do as ye will. Well, when that landed over here, it made sense to us because it was a way to remind us to consider what our teachers had taught, what our coven mates had discussed, and the discussions we had entered in, and the decisions we'd made for ourselves regarding the whole concept of harm. And then when Doreen came out with, I think, her first book, it would be the late 70s, she did something really interesting, which further reinforced to those of us who saw the concept of harm and harm none as spiritual decisions to make. She, in that book, wrote the Witch's Creed, in which she changed her previous phrasing from 8 words the Wiccan Rede fulfill to 8 words the Wiccan Creed fulfill. Creed, that's a whole different word than read. Creed has to do with belief. It has to do with a sense of knowing something out of a place of belief. In other words, it's not a law. It's not black and white. It's not this is right, this is wrong. If you do this, this will happen. If you do that, something will happen, whether it's a reward or a punishment. It became the Wiccan Creed, and she wrote a beautiful poem called The Witch's Creed. When she started referring to it as the Wiccan Creed instead of the Wiccan Rede, she was reflecting the sense of this being something other than mere guidance. It had to do with your personal experience, your understanding of what your powers were, and the way and the many ways you could choose to effect change, and the ways you made decisions about what you did. That Rede, which was wise counsel, then became the Witch's Creed, which said that collectively we have a belief in a way to do things. Now, do I believe personally that I will never harm accidentally or on purpose? No, I do not. That whole discussion of harm, what harm means when one chooses to harm, how one nulls incoming harm, how one nulls harm in the world or at the etheric level, it's all a very personal decision. The idea of the creed of harm none is that you stop and you think about what you're doing. You acknowledge there are many ways to achieve an end. You know what your end should be. If evil is being done, what you're most concerned with is what comes of it. You make a spiritual decision, if you honor the Witch's Creed, to deal with it at an energetic level. Have I ever harmed intentionally? I have. But my life lessons personally have been, I did not in the end benefit from that. And that is because of the way I look at the law of return, which will be another video, I'm sure, at some point. Joining in with the entity or the person that I perceive as being the source of evil, becoming one with them, battling them, doing the dance with them, to me, creates a maelstrom of energy, which, while I could solve the situation at hand, a whole maelstrom of energy has been stirred up and offered on this world and the other by that. We each learn as we go through life. Were there alternate ways that we could have handled a situation, even one which we know absolutely required drastic action? When I go back to those early days in those wonderful witches' salons where we talked about the concept of harm at great length and with varying opinions, and we did so because it was a very important part of the information that was handed down to us and the guidance that was given to us. When we took it from there to decide what it was for us, that's the conversations that actually have lived on the strongest in me over the years, in addition to 40 years of addressing at times some pretty drastic situations. And whether I gave in to the emotion of the moment and dealt with it in a direct way without consideration of harm, or whether I stopped and thought and took on the responsibility of knowing I had the power to change the situation in many different ways, and in choosing the way that dealt with what was created, the biggest mistakes I've learned in life. In hindsight, I look back on a situation where I was so absolutely positive that I had to deal with something in the sense of harming it. And I did my own bit in the process of actually magnifying its energy. I've experienced that first quote that we knew before we ever heard the 8 words, love and harm none. To work from a place of unity and bringing balance and settling things down has been more powerful to me than when I work from a place of destruction, rendering, tearing apart. The energy that's left when done, to me, has been the essence of the 8 words. And as my spiritual maturity grew over time, the part of that 8-word couplet that I started to really understand why it worked better when I worked from the place of harm none was the concept of will, and the fact that I embrace will as my own true will, what I am meant to be here, what I am aligned to my gods and how they move through me and inspire me. It will always be the Witch's Creed to me, and the 8 words matter deeply to me. I wish you mirth and reverence. Mary Part.